So, we are finally at the fourth and final part of the STAAR PowerPoint. So let us get started. Just keep on reminding you, and we do this one last time. This is the fourth and final STAAR PowerPoint. So we are done with it, or we will be done with it shortly. It's relatively short, 8 or 9 slides. Let's move on to the first slide. Wilson's 14 points. And as you can see there, we have a newspaper headline in the bottom right-hand corner. Germany asks peace on Wilson's 14 points. And there it is right there. And what we have over here in the bottom left is a picture of the speech given by Woodrow Wilson. He's right there before the joint session of Congress, in which he is outlining his 14 points. All right, let's get to this. The 14 points. Wilson broadened the war aims, which originally had been the defense of the freedom of the seas. He broadens that program from that one element to making the world safe for democracy. Okay, going to make the world safe for democracy. So in January of 1918, President Wilson makes a speech before Congress, which is this speech right down here. And the speech is entitled The 14 Points. And these 14 points are the points that Wilson would like to see adopted by the world, which he thought would bring about everlasting world peace. Let's get into it a little bit. And here are some of the major concepts of the of the 14 points, which Wilson felt would bring about peace after the end of World War I. As you can see there are 5 bullets under Wilson's 14 points. I'm going to give me a moment here. My iPad is reacting very slowly. There we go. Wilson's 14 points. The first major bullet: many major European nationalities would be given the right of self-determination about their own country and governments. Now, this is something that we have believed in since, well, it's the reason we fought the American Revolution. And so we felt that every nation, every people had the right to self-determination. This is one of the key elements of American democracy, self-determination. We felt that every country should have that right. Second point here: Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman empires would be divided into smaller nations. And if we haven't seen by now, we will see a map of the pre- and post-World War I Europe. And you'll see some of those nations that were created as a result of the breaking up of these two empires. Wilson called for reduction in arms, a removal of trade barriers, and an end to secret diplomacy. Reduction in arms, of course, was militarism. Trade barriers, you could argue, would be imperialism, and of course secret diplomacy, that would be the alliance system. So he wanted to end some of those causes, which led to the outbreak of World War I. Most important to Wilson was what he called the League of Nations, an international organization which was designed to mediate, to hear, debate, and decide upon international disputes, which of course would be able to avoid war. Now, naturally, this is sort of somewhat of a optimistic goal of the world, but the idea was by creating the League of Nations, we would be able to have a dispute, let's just say, between the United States and Mexico, let's say some type of boundary dispute, in which instead of us and Mexico going to war, we could go before the League and discuss this dispute, both tell our sides, and then the League would come up with a settlement, an agreement, a solution to our problem. That was the idea. So, the League of Nations. President Wilson campaigned across America and with European leaders. So he campaigned here in America and with European leaders, the English and the Germans, English and the French, to gain support for his League of Nations plan. But there's always a but. Americans were just not interested in giving others, particularly Europeans, They were just not interested in giving others the power to decide whether the U.S. could go to war or not. That's just one element. There were a number of other elements involved in the League and the concerns of the American public about the League. But that was one of them. We were somewhat concerned, would the League of Nations, dictate American policy? European leaders argued with Wilson because they wanted a harsher punishment for Germany than he did. They felt the Germans should be punished far more severely than what Wilson wanted, because again, in their minds, in their point of view, it was all Germany's fault. So the plan was in jeopardy. The Treaty of Versailles. Now, the Treaty of Versailles is the peace treaty which ends the war. It is based upon an armistice, and we have the armistice that was signed on November 11th, 1918. Okay, so the Treaty of Versailles is the peace settlement, the peace agreement between the Central Powers and the Allies. Germany finally agreed to an armistice, peace agreement, on, again, November the 11th, right there. At first, we called this, and for many decades, we called this Armistice Day, which you can see depicted down here in this little poster. But sometime after World War II, we changed it from Armistice Day to Veterans Day to honor all American vets. And why did Germany agree to this? Well, they were exhausted by the war. They're running out of men, running out of raw materials, running out of weapons and food, munitions, and so they were defeated. The U.S. met with the leaders of the French, the British, and the Italians to discuss peace terms. Ironically, the Russians, although they had fought on the winning side, keep in mind and remember that they had left the war early because of the overthrow of the Tsarist government of Russia, and a communist government took its place. The Russians, were not invited. The Russians were not invited to the peace talks because Russia had become communist, because Russia had left the war early, and partially because they were probably a huge part of it is because they're communist, but they were not invited to the peace talks because, again, they had left the war, and their choice of government, now communist, was not acceptable to the Allied powers. And here's a little bit of a headline depicting the armistice being signed. Now, the Treaty of Versailles was extremely harsh on the Germans, and I think you can see the number down here in the bottom right-hand corner, and I think you can read the phrase there. Let's see you collect it is the phrase that's mentioned right over here. I don't know if you can really read that, but here is the reparations. That is $33 billion. It does look like a 5, but it should be, I believe, 33 billion. Regardless of what the dollar amount was, is something Germany could not repay. So the terms of the Treaty of Versailles were extremely harsh on Germany. Now here's what some of the things here, some of the aspects of the treaty, which of course cost Germany. Number one, again, we're looking at Germany only right now. They had lost land that they had conquered, of course. They lost their overseas colonies. Okay. They were demilitarized, which means that their military was reduced in size, gutted really. They didn't really have a military. They had about 100,000, mostly police officers really, not really military, but their navy was cut down to nothing, their air force was reduced to nothing, on and on and on. So essentially they had no military. They had to accept blame for the war in what we refer to as the war guilt clause. They had to make reparations, which were payments for damages, and again, to that dollar amount. Now, what are some of the consequences? Well, this is something that the English and the French did not really look into. What would be the consequences of such harsh, again, very harsh on Germany. The Treaty of Versailles was extremely harsh on Germany. what would be the long-term consequences, something that they did not really think about. And again, let's be truthful here. These are politicians. These are not overly bright people in many ways. They are not overly deep thinkers or forward lookers in terms of how will my actions today affect me tomorrow. So the Treaty of Versailles, would lead to World War II. It's just that simple. Now, just so we don't think that the rest of the Central Powers got away scot-free, Austria-Hungary and the Turkish Empire, sometimes known as the Ottoman Empire, were also divided in what is now Eastern Europe, and their territories were taken and made into new countries. So it wasn't just the Germans who suffered, though they did suffer the most. The other Central Powers, the Austrians and the Turks, they lost as well. Now, the rejection of the League of Nations. We have a couple of pictures of cartoons down here at the bottom. The bottom left would be Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the main opponent to the League of Nations here in the United States and in the Senate, and because it was a treaty, the Treaty of Versailles. Any treaty the executive branch comes up with, whether it's negotiated personally by the President or Secretary of State or anyone within his administration, has to be ratified, has to be okayed by the U.S. Senate. And there were many in the Senate in the country who felt the League would handcuff, and you see the little picture right down here of Uncle Sam, right in here, being tied up, handcuffed by foreign nations, whether it be the English, the French, the Russians, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so that is the reason why we did not ratify it, because we were concerned that it would impact America, that the treaty would impact America and affect the way that we are able to rule ourselves. So we have the rejection of the League of Nations. Opponents of the League argue that it would drag the United States into unwanted military commitments. Again, if we're a member of the League decides that, again, just to use for an example a country, let's just say Russia. Russia had violated some aspect of the treaty or violated some other nation's sovereignty, then the League was going to do something about it militarily, then we would be forced to serve. Our American men and women would be forced to serve in the military against the Russians because the League said we had to. And there were numerous opponents of the League of Nations who argued that the League would drag us into these unwanted military commitments. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, down here, strongly opposed the creation of the League, saying the U.S., we'll clear that up a little bit, the U.S. would lose its freedom and it would lose its freedom of action. It would lose freedom. It would lose its sovereignty. Now, I think I've given this example before, but the United Nations, which is sort of the son of the League of Nations, has before it a small arms treaty that many member nations have signed. We, the United States, or at least the Obama administration, has agreed in principle to it. And if it were to become law in the United States, which, by the way, it never will, because it never will be ratified by the Senate, but if it were to be ratified, this small arms treaty would take away the rights of Americans to own small weapons, small guns, pistols, for example. And that would violate the Second Amendment, and America's never going to stand for that. But that was what we felt. That's what Henry Cabot Lodge felt. That's what many Americans felt that the League of Nations would do to us. So, our final thing here, the U.S. Congress was required to ratify the treaty before it would become law, and since they refused to ratify it, the United States never joined the League, even though it was our president. We never joined the League, even though it was our president who proposed it and pushed for it to be created. America retreats into isolationism. And we're going to take a look at, on this particular slide, a couple of things. Number one, you have in the bottom left-hand corner there, of course, George Washington. And this refers back to his farewell address in which he basically says we should stay out of European affairs. Okay, that's what that refers to. And the bottom right here we have the battlefield deaths, okay, of the major combatants. And you can see the little pie chart there. Now some of it's obscured by the STAAR desktop trial there. I don't know why we have it there, but it is. Here you have the United States at 116,000. Again, relatively few compared to the Germans, who lost 1.8 million. The Russians 1.7 million, even though the Russians, did not stay in the war for the entire time. They left about a year or so before the war ended. You got the French down here at 1.3 million. Austria, I believe that is 1.2 million that they lost. Again, these are just deaths. This is not wounded or a combination. This is just those who have died. The Brits lost a little over 900,000. The Italians, 650,000. And the Ottoman Empire, a little over 320,000. So, all told, we're looking at about 20 million dead, civilian and soldier. And those are just some of the numbers of the dead on the major combatant side. Now, there were other countries who participated to lesser extent who had whatever number who were killed, but those are some of the major combatants. By 1919, getting back to us retreating to isolationism, the American people had become quite disillusioned by world affairs, which of course is World War I. Victory in the war had come at a very high price in lives and in dollars, blood and money. And that's not a high, that price was too high for many Americans. Americans began to rethink what Washington had said, and that he was right. He is George Washington, of course he's right, with his advice about staying out of European entanglements. And we, America, began to look at the well-being here at home. We begin to look at our own well-being, taking care of our own events, our own affairs, taking care of our own business, minding our own business. And so, as a result of World War I, we began to retreat back into isolationism. And I believe this is our final slide. And give me a second here while my iPad is extremely slow at the moment. It's taking a few moments to get the drawing mode up and running so I can use all the pretty lines and colors. There we go. So, American isolationism. America returned to a policy of isolationism. It has the word turned, but it's really returned to a policy of isolationism because of our oceans, because of our own self-sufficiency, because of our political belief system. We felt that we did not really need to become involved, that we should remain isolated, we should remain neutral. And so we were going to separate themselves meaning us, we separate ourselves from other countries' affairs. Again, this is the key part right there. Their problems, we felt, were not ours. Their wars, their conflicts were not our business. We wanted to remain neutral. We wanted to sell goods to both sides, but we did not want to get involved in any type of conflict. So we turned our back on Europe by a couple of things. We raised tariffs on imported goods to protect U.S. businesses. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods. So if we raise tariffs on French clothing, just for an example, we raised tariffs on it. It made that clothing, those clothes that we imported from France, more expensive, and so it made American clothing probably more comparable in terms of price, maybe even less expensive than the French clothing. So therefore, people, all things being equal, tend to buy American. So by raising tariffs, it would protect American businesses and protect American jobs. Number two, and our reasons for turning our back on Europe, or how we turned our back on Europe, we were going to restrict European immigration. And we'll see a couple examples of this in the 1820s. Never mentioned it in this chapter, but they'll be mentioned in the next chapter. Especially from Eastern and Southern Europe, what we refer to as the new immigrants. And this we covered something, covered this in a previous chapter, the new immigrants, okay, right there. Kind of ran out of room to write it up, but you get the idea. So these new immigrants are from Eastern and Southern Europe, and we started to limit them in great detail. We rejected the Treaty of Versailles. Why? Because it was never ratified by the Senate. Henry Cabot Lodge and others rejected it because, again, we felt that it would be too much of a strain on America. It would eat into American sovereignty. And so we refused to join the League of Nations, which was the brainchild of our President Woodrow Wilson. These were all the signs of America's decision to isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. So essentially we said, you stay over there, do whatever you want to do, leave us alone. So that is our final slide. We have finished the 4-part PowerPoint on the STAAR Chapter 9. The STAAR PowerPoint that I just showed you, we've just been working with, or at least the 4. Like I told you before, I don't know where the heck we got it, but it was a very well done, very nicely written, very well written PowerPoint looking at the STAAR material. And pretty much whatever was in this is going to be on the test. So I did this for you so that way you would be better prepared for the test. Now we've covered the material from Chapter 9 in a couple of different ways, a couple of different occasions. Everything that you probably need to know on the test has been covered one time or another. So all you need to do now is to prepare, to review, to think about it, to study. Okay, well that's going to finish this one. Bye.